In the far north of Norway, there is a mountain with a door in the side of it. Behind that door, past a corridor of concrete and blast steel, in air held permanently below freezing, sits the most important thing this country owns. It is not oil. It is not money. Almost no Norwegian will ever see it, and the government barely mentions that it exists. We will get to what is inside. It takes about half an hour, and it is worth the wait because the object only makes sense once you understand the people who put it there. So start somewhere easier. Walk into a Norwegian village and try to work out which house belongs to the richest family. You will get it wrong. The houses are the same size. They are painted the same red, and I will come back to that color because the real reason for it is far better than the one you have been told. The cars in the driveways are quiet and boxy and electric, and the man loading firewood into the back of one of them might run a fishing boat, or he might run a shipping company, and nothing on that street will tell you which. That is not modesty. That is design. My name is Matthias. This is 4K Travel. Over the next half hour, I want to show you what life is actually like in the richest and most beautiful country on earth, including the parts that are cold, expensive, and genuinely difficult, because a version of this video where Norway is perfect would waste your time and insult theirs. 3 things to hold on to as we go. Why a country floating on oil charges its own citizens close to $8 a gallon? Why the coastline is red? And what is inside the mountain? Begin with the word rich, because it does not mean here what it means where you live. Ask a Norwegian to describe their wealth and money almost never comes up. What comes up is a list of absences. A hospital bill capable of ending a family. A degree that arrives welded to 20 years of debt. Old age turning up with no plan behind it. The wealth is not what they can buy. It is the length of the list of things they never have to be afraid of. That runs on tax rates that would make most of you close this video. And Norwegians hand the money over without the resentment you would expect, for a reason that is almost boring. They can see where it went. It went into the tunnel they drove through this morning, the school their 7-year-old walks to alone, the ferry that still crosses to a village of 200 people because 200 people live there. Trust is the actual product, not the fjords, not the fun, the trust. Someone who visited both Norway and Finland wrote about being floored by exactly this, by watching people surrender an enormous share of their income while genuinely believing it would come back to them. That belief is not a national personality trait. It is what happens when institutions do what they promised over and over for 80 years, until believing them stops being naive and starts being accurate. The older, smaller version of it has a name, dugnad, unpaid collective work and completely unremarkable. The building association clears the shared yard on a Saturday in April. Parents show up to repaint the sports club. Nobody is paid. Everyone comes, and quietly not coming is noticed. Dugnad is what a society does instead of hiring someone, and it dies the moment enough people decide it is somebody else's turn. Now, the houses. There is one word that explains them, and it did not come from a philosopher or a king. It came from a novel almost nobody outside Scandinavia has read. In 1933, a writer named Axel Sandemos published a book about a small invented town called Jante, and he gave that town 10 laws. You are not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you are smarter than us. You are not to think you are better than us. 10 of them, each turning the screw a little further. Sandemos was not being complimentary. He was writing an attack on small town suffocation, on the way a community grinds a person down for the crime of wanting more than the community wants for them. Norway read the insult and kept it. Janteloven, the Law of Jante, is a household word there now, argued about at dinner tables, credited by some for the flattest equality in Europe, and blamed by others for a national inability to take a compliment or celebrate anyone who wins. A whole country adopted its own harshest criticism as a description of itself and never let it go. You feel it within an hour of landing. Nobody expects you to perform enthusiasm. Small talk with a stranger on a bus reads as a mild social offense rather than a friendly gesture. Silence between two people sitting together is not awkward, and nobody hurries to fill it. Somebody watching a video about Norway once wrote that it must be heaven for introverts, and that one comment got more attention than almost anything else on the video. They had it exactly right. If you are the kind of person who leaves a party exhausted, this country feels like someone finally turned the volume down. If you feed on attention, it will feel like being smothered by extremely polite pillows. None of this came from the oil. The oil is recent. This starts with hunger. Roughly 3% of Norway can be farmed. The rest is rock, forest, water, ice and mountain, stretched so far north that whole towns spend weeks each winter with no sunrise at all. For almost the entire history of this country that was not scenery, it was arithmetic. A valley fed a fixed number of families and not one more. A fishing village survived the winter if everyone pulled and buried people if one man did not. No surplus, no cushion. In that math, the person who takes more than his share is not ambitious. He is a danger to everyone standing near him. Humility here started as a survival protocol and only got promoted to a virtue much later, which brings up the Vikings, and my first real opinion in this video. We remember them wrong, and we remember them wrong because the people who wrote the accounts down were the ones being raided. What actually mattered was the shipbuilding and the navigation, the trade routes running from the Arctic down to Constantinople. A longship is not fundamentally a weapon. It is an admission. It says the land here will not feed us, and we are going to have to go and ask the sea, every year, forever. Then centuries of not being in charge. Union with Denmark. Union with Sweden. Full sovereignty arrived only in 1905, which makes Norway younger as an independent state than the telephone, and then 5 years of German occupation finished the job of shaping how this country feels about power. Spend most of your history as the junior partner in someone else's kingdom, and you do not develop an appetite for display. You develop an appetite for not being noticed. Then in 1969, at a field called Ekofisk, after years of drilling that produced mostly expensive nothing, they hit it. Production started in the early 70s. Inside a single generation, a poor corner of Western Europe became one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. And what happened next is second opinion, the most impressive thing any government has done with a windfall in the last 100 years. Because the normal outcome is a catastrophe. Money floods in, the currency balloons. Every other industry withers because nothing can compete with the one printing cash. The political class gets comfortable, and when the wells run down, there is a stadium, a palace, a mountain of debt, and a country that has forgotten how to make anything. Economists gave it a name, the resource curse. The list of countries that walked into it is long, and it is not a list of failed states, it is full of places that should have known better. Norway built a fund. Petroleum revenue goes into a sovereign wealth fund that invests it outside Norway deliberately, in thousands of companies across dozens of markets, precisely so it cannot overheat the economy that owns it. A fiscal rule caps what any government may spend in a normal year, pegged to expected return, rather than to whatever a politician needs before an election. It is among the largest funds of its kind that has ever existed, and it holds a real slice of the world's listed companies. The smartest thing Norway did with its oil money was refuse to touch most of it and hand it to Norwegians who have not been born. Now, the fuel, as promised. A viewer of another Norway video looked up the price of petrol there, found a figure around $2.11 and wrote into, say the whole claim was nonsense. Fair enough, and he had walked straight into a trap that catches a lot of people. So let me clear it up. That number is per litro. There are roughly 3.8 liters in a US gallon, which means a price that looks almost gentle to an American eye is closer to $8 a gallon on a good day in a country that exports crude. That is deliberate. The tax is not a side effect of the policy, it is the policy. Make the old way expensive and the new way cheap, then wait. What Norwegians did was buy electric cars at a rate no other country has come close to matching, and the revenue goes back into the tunnels and the ferries and the schools which answers the question somebody always asks, which is who exactly benefits from taxing fuel that hard. The person paying it does, eventually, in a form that does not look anything like fuel. Third opinion, and I would rather say it than have you say it in the comments. Norway is financing a domestic green transition with the profits from selling fossil fuels to everybody else. It is one of the cleanest places on earth to drive a car and one of Europe's largest exporters of oil and gas simultaneously, both true at once. That contradiction is a live and unresolved fight inside Norwegian politics, and anyone presenting this country as a Finnish climate success story is selling you a story with the ending removed. Oslo, then, the capital of all that money behaving nothing like it. No forest of towers, no boulevard of engines. The money went into what you use rather than what you look at, including a harbor clean enough that office workers swim in it at lunch. Two buildings facing each other across the water tell the whole story. Akershus fortress went up from the late 13th century onward. Grey stone, thick, plain, barely decorated, built by a small kingdom that understood exactly how easy it would be to take. It is not really architecture, it is anxiety with a roof on it. Facing it is the Oslo Opera House, finished in 2008, white marble sloping straight down into the fjord. And the decision that matters is not the marble, it is that the roof is a public square. You walk up it, anyone can. No ticket, no dress code, no rope, no requirement to be the sort of person who attends opera. The most expensive cultural building in the country was designed so that the people who will never go inside can stand on top of it. That is the Law of Jante poured into concrete. The building is allowed to be beautiful. It is not allowed to look down on you. The same instinct runs the National Day. Most countries mark theirs with soldiers and hardware. On the 17th of May, Norway sends children, thousands of them, through the streets with flags and school bands, while the adults line the route in dugnad, the regional costume hand-embroidered with patterns that announce which valley a family came from. There are no missiles in it. The message is not that the country is dangerous. The message is that the country is still here. That regionalism goes deeper than clothing. Norway maintains two official written standards of its own language, Bokmål and Nynorsk, side by side, because the mountains kept the valleys apart so long that no single version ever won. A country wealthy enough to simply pick one, choosing to keep both, because deleting somebody's written language is a way of standing above them. And at Edinburgh Zoo there is a king penguin who holds formal rank in the Norwegian King's Guard, has been knighted and is inspected on parade with total seriousness by soldiers who do not crack. This is real, ongoing, and completely deadpan. Make of it what you will. Leave the city, and the philosophy hardens into timber. At Borgund stands a staved church, built around 1180. Dark tarred wood, roofs stacked in tiers like something growing out of the ground. Dragon heads on the gables lifted straight from the pre-Christian world and never taken down. It was assembled with interlocking joints and wooden pegs, and not one iron nail, from slow-grown pine, so dense with resin that it fights rot on its own, then tarred and retarred for 800 years. Step inside and it is dark, tight and cold, and it smells like a woodshed after rain. Europe built cathedrals to make a person feel small. This was built to keep the weather off you while you think. At Helleren, two small wooden houses sit beneath an enormous overhanging cliff, using the mountain itself as their roof. Nobody flattened anything. Somebody studied the rock face until they found the one spot where the rock was willing to help, and built there. The houses are small on purpose, because in that climate a large house is a house you cannot heat, and the house you cannot heat is a slow way of dying. And now the red paint. You know the image. The Rorbu, fishermen's cabins on stilts, at the waterline at Rhine and Hamney, blood red against black rock and green water, mountains stacked behind them like a wall. It is on every calendar in the world. You will be told they were painted red so fishermen could find them through a blizzard. Lovely story. Almost certainly not the reason. Red ochre pigment was a byproduct of copper mining, cheap everywhere in Scandinavia, and it protected bare wood beautifully for close to nothing. White paint was expensive. So for a long stretch of Scandinavian history, the color of your house was a public announcement about your bank balance. Red meant you worked for a living. White meant you had arrived. Which makes the most photographed image in this country the one sitting on your desktop right now. An entire coastline of people choosing the cheap paint. Norway's visual signature is a monument to not spending money. What does a rich Norwegian buy today? A hut, a cabin, usually small, often with a grass roof that swallows it into the hillside, frequently with very little luxury inside. The status object of one of the wealthiest societies on the planet is a wooden box in the forest where nobody can reach you. The point was never the cabin. The point is the silence. The food obeys the same rule. Everything traditional here was invented to get somebody through a winter. Brunost, the brown cheese, made by boiling whey until the milk sugars caramelize, which comes out the color of fudge and tastes like salted caramel that changed its mind halfway. Poricol, mutton and cabbage layered in a pot with whole black peppercorns and cooked until the meat gives up, so unanimously the national dish that it has its own day in September. And cod, which takes me back to something from the opening, because long before there was oil, this country's entire economy hung on a wooden rack in the wind. We reached it in about 10 minutes. Out of the villages, then and into the reason most of you clicked. Norwegians have a word, thrill of sleep, open-air life, and it is not a hobby. Children go outside in weather that would close schools across most of the world, packed into enough wool to make it survivable, because a person who cannot function outdoors is understood to have been failed by somebody. Old people ski, not competitively, as transport on a Tuesday to buy milk. Underneath that sits a legal principle called Allemansretten, the right to roam, written into law in the 1950s. On uncultivated land, anyone may walk, ski, camp, and pick berries regardless of who holds the deed, provided they respect the place and leave nothing behind. So, in one of the richest countries on earth, you cannot buy a mountain and put a fence around it. Money here does not purchase the right to exclude people, and I think that single law explains more about Norway than the oil fund does. The land keeps everyone honest too. Preikestolen ends without warning 600 meters above the Fjord, with no railing, no barrier, and no gesture at all toward making you feel safe. Kjeragbolten is a boulder jammed between two cliff walls with close to a kilometer of nothing underneath it. Trolltunga is 10 to 12 hours on foot, round trip in weather that can turn while you are still climbing, because it is not a viewpoint. It is a mountain that happens to have a viewpoint attached. And the fjords get described wrongly almost every time. A fjord is not a place where the sea pushed into the land. A fjord is a valley that a glacier spent thousands of years grinding out, and the sea only turned up afterwards to fill what the ice had already caught. Narrow fjord narrows to a few hundred meters between walls climbing well over 1,000. At Giranger Fjord, the Seven Sisters come down one side in 7 separate strands, and by late summer several of them have stopped entirely. Norwegian engineering holds the same posture. Trollstigen climbs a mountainside in 11 hairpin bends. The Lærdal Tunnel runs almost 25 kilometers through solid rock and installs strange blue lighting in caverns along the way so drivers do not quietly lose their minds in the dark. The Atlantic Road accepts that the ocean will occasionally break clean across it and closes when the sea insists. Nobody here defeats the terrain. They negotiate, and they take the deal offered. Follow the coast to Bergen, and you meet the Norway that existed before anyone suspected there was oil down there. Bergen is what survives of the Hanseatic trading houses. A row of wooden fronts on the old wharf, leaning at angles that would fail any modern inspection, floors visibly out of level, the whole street, smelling of tar and rain and several centuries of wet timber. What made Bergen rich was not gold, and it was not spice. It was dried fish. Here is the payoff. Every winter, cod migrate down to the waters around Lofoten to spawn. Every winter for more than 1,000 years, people have met them there, split them open, and hung them on wooden racks in the open air. No salt, no smoke, no fire. The Arctic wind does the entire job. What comes off those racks keeps for years, and it moved across medieval Europe as one of the most dependable sources of protein anybody had. Norway entered the world economy as a fish, drying in the cold, and stayed there for 800 years before the oil arrived. At Henningsberg, there is a football pitch on a flat shelf of rock ringed by open ocean, drying racks standing right beside it. It is the most photographed pitch on Earth, and it has no seating, because nobody built it to be watched. It was built because that was the only flat ground in the village. Somebody complained under a video like this that it contained no Norwegian music, and they were right. So here it is. The instrument to know is the hardanger fiddle, which carries a second set of strings running underneath the played ones. Nobody touches those. They vibrate on their own in sympathy, and the effect is sound that seems to arrive from somewhere just behind the music. It is faintly unnerving the first time you hear it. Edvard Grieg took those melodies out of the valleys and into concert halls, and his house outside Bergen is a museum now, with the small writing. Hot still standing by the water where he actually worked. Further north, the Sami have Joy, which is not a song about a person or a place. It is an attempt to summon one. You do not sing about someone, you join them. And then, in the early 1990s, in one of the safest and most orderly societies on Earth, a handful of young Norwegians made some of the most extreme music ever recorded. Corpse paint, real violence, a string of arson attacks on historic wooden churches, some of them centuries old. Fourth opinion. Part of that was ordinary criminality and deserves to be called that, with no romance attached. But I do not believe it is a coincidence that it happened here. Build a society that asks everyone to be moderate and equal and quiet, leave it almost nowhere to put the people who cannot do that, and sooner or later something climbs out of the basement wearing makeup. There is a gentler version of the same pressure, which is that the most famous Norwegian alive is a striker who scores at an inhuman rate and celebrates by sitting down cross-legged on the grass. A lot of you found this video because you were watching him. Even the loudest thing Norway currently exports performs calm. North now, until the country stops resembling Europe. Tromsø sits well inside the Arctic Circle, and its harbor does not freeze, because the Gulf Stream drags warm Atlantic water absurdly far up the map and keeps a coastline livable that has no business being livable. In winter, the sun does not clear the horizon for weeks and the sky above the town fills with green. In summer, it never sets, and people stop organizing their lives around the clock and start organizing them around light. Offshore, orcas and humpbacks coming behind the herring, close enough to watch from a small boat in December. Two different people ask, underneath a video like this, whether they could actually survive that darkness. Nobody answered them, so I will. For some people, no, the polar night is not charming. Seasonal depression is a real and openly discussed public health problem up there. Daylight lamps are ordinary household objects, and Norwegians talk about winter mental health with a directness most countries still cannot manage. The cultural response has a name, koselig, usually translated as cozy, which undersells it badly. Candles lit at 3 in the afternoon, wool, a fire, coffee that takes time to make, 4 people in one small warm room with nowhere else they need to be. Koselig is not an aesthetic. It is a countermeasure built by people who knew exactly what they were fighting. This is also Sami country, and here the story gets uncomfortable, which is precisely why it belongs in the middle of this video instead of in a footnote at the end. Through much of the 20th century, the Norwegian state ran a deliberate campaign to assimilate the Sami, language suppressed, children pushed into Norwegian schooling, an entire culture treated as a phase to be grown out of. That is within living memory, not ancient history, and Norway has formally apologized for it. And it is not finished. When Norway builds wind farms in the north, some of that construction lands on reindeer herding ground. In 2021, the Norwegian Supreme Court ruled that the turbines at Fosen violated Sami herders' rights, and the turbines kept turning while the state worked out what to do about it, which is how young Sami activists ended up blocking ministry doors in Oslo. Green energy, uncontested indigenous land, in a country that thinks of itself as a global model for climate policy and human rights at the same time. Fifth opinion, and then I will stop giving them. A society where nobody is meant to stand out only works if you are counted inside the group in the first place. The Sami spent a long century being told they were not, and no amount of your footage should be allowed to smooth that over. which finally takes us back to the mountain. Svalbard is where human civilization visibly gives up. The road ends a few kilometers outside town. Anyone traveling beyond the settlements is expected to carry a rifle, because the polar bears outnumber the arguments against it. You will hear that it is illegal to die there. That is a myth, repeated in more travel videos than I can count. What is actually true is dollar and stranger. Burials in the Longyearbyen cemetery largely stopped around the middle of the last century, because permafrost preserves rather than decomposes, so the dead are generally taken back to the mainland. And inside the mountain outside that town, behind the series of blast doors, sits the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Hundreds of thousands of seed samples from agricultural collections all over the world, held in cold rock as a backup copy of the planet's food supply. It is not a symbol, it has been used. When war destroyed the seed bank in Aleppo, researchers withdrew from Svalbard and rebuilt what had been lost. That is what is behind the door. The quietest country in Europe, whose entire social operating system is built on not drawing attention to itself, put the backup of human agriculture inside a frozen mountain at the top of the world, told almost nobody, and has never once asked for credit. Before I let you go, the honest accounting, because you have earned one. Norway is expensive, not slightly. Groceries, restaurants, a beer, a plumber, a taxi. All of it takes the wind out of you, and the people who have actually been there say so before anyone else does. Salaries are high, but savings brought in from anywhere else evaporate fast. The winters are long and dark, and genuinely hard on some people, and if you have a respiratory condition, the cold is not a minor detail. Housing in Oslo is punishing. The whole social contract runs on tax rates that many of you would refuse outright. And Janteloven, the same rule that keeps this place level, is described by plenty of Norwegians as a ceiling. A quiet pressure, not to try too hard, not to shine, and eventually, for some of them, to leave. One last thing, and it is not mine. A Norwegian watched a video like this about his own country and wrote that it felt right and wrong at the same time. Accurate on the facts, he said, and still somehow not the real thing. He is correct, and I would rather admit that than pretend otherwise. Everything here is Norway observed from the outside. The version from inside is deeper and messier and full of things no amount of research ever reaches. If you are Norwegian and you are still watching, the comments belong to you. Correct me. I would rather be corrected than flattered. But this part I will stand behind. Norway is not humble because it lacks confidence. It is humble because it was raised by a landscape where nobody survives alone, and it did not let go of that lesson when the money showed up. The oil could have bought spectacle. It bought tunnels, trust, and the savings account for people who have not been born yet. And you cannot copy it. 5.5 million people, extraordinary natural wealth, centuries of shared hardship, and the level of social trust that took generations to earn and could be spent in one. Nobody legislates that into existence next year. What Norway proves is smaller than that, and more useful. It is possible to become enormously rich and then decide together that the money was never the point, that the road matters more than the car, that the roof of the opera house belongs to everyone, that the finest thing you can do with a fortune is make it boring. The world is extremely loud about what it owns. Norway got rich and kept its voice down. I am Mateus, this is 4K Travel, and if that was worth your half-hour, subscribe, because there are more of these coming. And answer me this one before you go, because a viewer asked it under a video like this, and I have not been able to drop it since. If you could take exactly one Norwegian value home and install it in your own country tomorrow, one, which would you take? Some of you are already going to say the trust. I want to know.